right. Well, welcome to the Responsive Weekly discussion. We're so excited to have you back with us again for another week. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Gabe Cooper, the CEO of Virtuous. Again, I'm Hillary Sutton, your host. And today we're talking about the future of fundraising. What can we learn from 2020 to impact 2021? And so I want to ask you to start off, hop in the chat and share with us what has been your biggest challenge that you've faced in fundraising in 2020. What has been the biggest challenge that you've faced? And Noah is also here. He's a little incognito, but he's going to be monitoring the chat. And so I'm curious to hear what your challenges have been. And so Noah, maybe you can pop onto the audio and share with us anything that.
Yeah, nothing's come through yet, but I think what's interesting is we hosted a few intimate conversations yesterday with some fundraising leaders, and the common thread across 50 fundraising leaders around the country was everyone's cautiously optimistic about the future, because 2020 provided a lot of growth for a lot of organizations in fundraising, or maybe kind of flat lines, but it also stretched systems and programs and kind of push them beyond their limits. So even though 2020 was kind of a confusing year, some people saw growth, some people saw flatlines, but like there's so much stress and strain that really there's a commonality of like uncertainty, but cautious optimism. And that's what we heard yesterday on those conversations. Sean said he's finding time to test all the new things we had to do so quickly. So just the fact that there's been innovation so fast is something Sean felt like was a big challenge for him. Thanks, Sean, for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. The cautious optimism makes me think a little bit about this next slide. If I can share it. A lot of people are just like referring to 2020 as a dumpster fire, but I submit that 2020 is more than just a dumpster fire, especially if you're in the nonprofit space and the fundraising space. It's been so much. It's been teams going remote overnight. It's been, a chaotic election season, civil rights movements driving systemic change, and then obviously the devastating impact of COVID-19. And so it has been challenging, but there is such an opportunity for growth and such an opportunity to learn. And so today I'm thrilled to chat about what we can learn from 2020 with Gabe and what we can apply to 2021. Gabe, you sit at a really interesting seat because you have this view and this connection to so many nonprofits. You can really see what's happening across, a wide swath of what's happening across the entire, nonprofit industry. So I want to ask you, what did 2020 really teach us about digital transformation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think digital transformation is kind of a hard word. You really have to define it. I think what most nonprofits realized is that so much of their in-person fundraising was impacted, especially if you're event-driven. And so there was this push to, oh my gosh, we need digital transformation. We have to go digital, which is exactly right. I heard somebody say yesterday that we'll probably see a decade's worth of digital transformation in one single year, which is really powerful. Wow. So many organizations have been talking about, we have to learn to operate virtually. We can't do everything in person. We have to up our email game. We have to try, social ads, and they just never got around to it. And this year they've got around to all the things that they, systems change, all that kind of stuff. And so it's very, very exciting. I think the one thing that is important that I think we have to realize is some people think, well, we have to move to Zoom meetings, or we have to just do more email or better email than what we've done in the past. And what we're finding is digital doesn't mean just doing email better or web better. In fact, if you're anything like me, your email inbox is more crowded than it's ever been. You just run through in the morning and delete half the stuff. You're not even reading subject lines. You're just reading who's in the front field. You're just deleting, right? And so in a world that's being flooded with more digital communication and COVID, we can't just think digital transformation means email or web. I think the important thing for us to realize is what it really means is innovation more than digital transformation. And so in the fundraising world, for example, I think there's a couple of big trends. And I know I'm sort of taking this question where I want it, but I think one of the things we're seeing is in our new subscription economy, most of our lives are subscription based, right? So my Netflix account, my Amazon Prime account, if I look at my monthly credit card bill, half the stuff on there is a monthly subscription. That's the world your donors live in. And so there's this amazing opportunity to create sort of monthly giving products to fit into how they're already transacting in the world, right? So the Compassions and World Visions, the big child sponsorship organizations, figured this out a long time ago, where if you can deliver value to a donor and a story, you can get a monthly gift for a really long time. But the rest of the world is primed for this. And so I think the one big move we've seen this year is people moving to monthly giving products to take advantage of the new subscription-based economy. And that's been super powerful. The other one is a move to more multi-channel communication. And so not just email, but email, text, social, letters, calls, all of it together. We actually did a study on that recently, and we've seen a lot of organizations start moving in that direction. There's several other things as well. I'm going to stop there and kind of let you ask questions around that.
Yeah, well, I would love to hear more about, if we want to focus more on sustainability in our fundraising, like what are other ways that we can do that?
Yeah, and so I think it's funny, as bad as this year's been, giving hasn't been that bad. In fact, I think as a sector, we're maybe down 3% for where we should have been this quarter. But in faith-based, human services, a lot of these key sectors, the arts have been hit pretty hard, but in a lot of sectors, it's up. In some cases, faith-based or human services, international relief and development have been up 20, 30%. And so I think what we're finding right now is many organizations have a lot of new donors that just came out of the woodwork. And so now the biggest imperative that a lot of these organizations face is how do you cultivate that relationship after that first gift in a post-COVID world or in a COVID world, right? And so I think for sustainability, like a lot of nonprofits need to be really narrowly focused on how do we move somebody from a first gift to a second gift like that. And because what that signals is somebody's engaged. They weren't just tipping your organization because they saw an ad somewhere. They're actually moving toward you. And so how do we lean in and close the distance with those donors to move them from a first gift to a second gift and to begin to retain them over time? And so one of the big moves we see here is more and more people moving to more sophisticated new donor welcome series. And so a new donor welcome series that takes a new donor and introduces them to your organization very quickly, like not waiting 60 days to send them a welcome package, but how do they get an email, a text message, a call, and a postcard all within that first 30 days, thanking them for the gift, showing their impact, and asking them to engage more deeply. And we've seen that move be really powerful as a way to begin to retain and create sustainable revenue going forward.
That's great. And that's like a perfect segue into my next slide. I'm curious if those listening or watching can hop into the chat. I'm curious to know if 2020 was a surprisingly good year for you, if it was bad, if it felt in terms of fundraising similar to previous years. We kind of get an understanding of, who's here with us today. But what you were saying, Gabe, reminded me of something that you've said before, and I'd love for you to share it again, is that generosity begets generosity.
Yep.
So can you kind of unpack that idea and what that means for fundraisers?
Yes. I think there's an important realization that the best fundraisers and best nonprofits make is that it's not all about you and your organization, right? It's about it's sad, but it's true. I mean, at the end of the day, your donors want to make a difference in the world, and they're not getting, when they give you money, they're not getting a pair of shoes or a new car in return. What they're getting is a dopamine hit of doing something good in the world. But more than that, they're they're having the opportunity, you're giving them the opportunity to sort of make a difference, to leave a legacy, to do true good. And you have to think deeply about how you're delivering that value to donors. And so, yeah, generosity begets generosity means you have to be able to think about how you give to your donor before they give to you or when they give to you. And so that means something different for every organization. This is actually where the arts make it a little bit easier, right? Like if I'm giving a gift to a museum and I show up and I see beautiful art or to an opera or ballet, that transactional value is more clear. If you're in human services, international relief and development, it's a little bit more tricky to get there, but you have to think about how you're equipping your donor to tell your story, how you're getting them excited, and how you're delivering real value. And that only comes through listening, by the way. And this is where a lot of organizations struggle, is they don't actually know their donors, or they don't know what their donors want. They don't fully know why they gave. And so the only remedy here is just listening carefully to your donors to help you understand the value that they're deriving from their gift. And so you can begin reproducing that and reciprocating it and giving over and over again.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to think about how the pandemic has impacted different organizations in different ways, because some of those organizations where the donor is sort of the beneficiary, like the arts, it's been really hard. But then you have organizations like Muttville in California, where their donors, I mean, they have struggled to keep up with the demand of people who wanted dogs this year. So it's fascinating. I mean, every organization has had their own sort of set of challenges.
And
That's
Hillary
right.
and Gabe, if I can jump in here, just to give some feedback from the audience. So everyone was kind of responding to your question around a 3 or 4. So I think people are relatively positive about how 2020 went. The one nuance here, and I would almost kind of push this to you all to discuss, is a lot of people express that the first half of the year was really good. So going into the summer and whatnot, they saw huge increases. They were, up year over year. Everything was going in the right direction. But they're expressing that the fall has been really tough. Like it's slowed down a lot. And I think this reveals what we talked about a little bit yesterday too, which was 2020 is like not a normal year. And we need to almost think about it differently and how we then respond in 2021.
Yeah.
And we can't use 2020 as a benchmark. And so I think the question becomes is like, well, then what? And I know you touched on this a little bit, Gabe, around like a lot of new donors gave to organizations. So how do we cultivate new donors? But is there other ways we need to be thinking differently about 2021?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I actually remember you talking about how when you're doing international relief and development, how you would have a crisis year, right? So you have a year where there's a Katrina. And so that causes a spike. It causes everybody to act different, but you can't sort of take that as this is how things are going to be forever. And so, yeah, I think still the most imminent threat, even if you did see a big spike in donors early in the year, your biggest problem isn't can we keep acquiring new donors? Your biggest problem is how do we retain and build relationships with the new donors that we have? How do we expand the lifetime value of those folks that came on file? So again, I think that, for all those new folks that were new to your organization in the spring, and then fall's getting, back to what maybe closer to what you expected fall to be, or a little bit worse, how are we going after all of those new donors and really bringing them in the fold and connecting them with their impact? And so that we're cultivating our base better than we have before, because we don't know what's going to happen in 2021. Could be a great year, may not be, but you're never going to regret really building relationships with your existing base. I do think going into 2021, there's got to be a little bit of a sense of more of the same. I don't think things are ever going to return to exactly like they were before, right? And so if we're talking about that normal to come back, we're going to be waiting around a long time. And so I do think you have to look at what worked in 2020 and figure out how to ask the right questions to determine what worked and what didn't work, and pour more gasoline on the fires around stuff that didn't work. And you're going to have to continue to embrace this attitude of agility and innovation. I think that a lot of nonprofits were forced to innovate. Our volunteers didn't show up. We had to furlough staff. We could do no in-person events, and they innovated and they moved fast. I think that mentality, you can't think, well, how do we get out of innovation mode and go back to normal mode? Don't think that way. Stay in innovation mode. Know that this is going to be a long haul through 21, and keep being agile and going after stuff that works.
One other thing that you've mentioned to me before is it's important also, like, yes, have an awareness of what's of the most current events right now, but also be thinking about the more macro picture of like aging wealth. So what are some ways that you think that nonprofits really need to strategize around that?
Yeah. Yeah, aging wealth is a unique one. I mean, you have this generation of boomers that are giving more and more away. It's funny. I just got a call from my dad, who's a boomer, last week, and now they have money to give away, and they don't have kids running around to spend money on. So he's asking me, where should I give my money, right? And there's a group of those people that have really embraced donor advised funds, and so I think you need to learn and get up to speed on donor advised funds and how those new mechanisms of giving work. I do think it's important, so many organizations you talk to are like, man, the average age of our donor is 61 years old. We really need to push down the average age of our donor. That's not, people are just 61 when they start giving more money, and they will always be 61 when they give more money. So your average age is always going to be older than you want. It's not necessarily a problem. I think the important realization here is that your existing donors, it's the same donors, but they've actually changed, right? So my dad is a perfect example. My dad would be the traditional sort of direct mail donor in the past, but the guy does not get off of Facebook and Instagram now. Like, he's on it all the time. He's transacting digitally. He knows what a DAF is, right? And so your existing donors, the wealthy ones at the older end of your file, they've changed. And so I think it's important that we don't just think about innovation in terms of how do we get new donors, or talk to millennials, or talk to people younger than millennials. It's really the understanding that our base at that wealthy end or older end has changed, and how do we begin to adapt to meet them where they're at.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit more about a post 2020 world. 2020 has served as a giant reminder that we don't know what awaits us. None of us could have predicted what this year would be like. And now we're looking at building a strategy for 2021 that who knows what's going to, no matter what you're trying to plan for in 2021, you don't know what it's going to be like. So in terms of fundraising and for nonprofit leaders, how do you build a strategy in such unpredictable times? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I like the way Noah's put it in the past, where it's you can't do nothing but use a pencil, not a Sharpie, for your 2021 planning. And by that, I mean, know that you're going to erase some stuff. So you do not want to operate without a plan. You need a plan. You have to put a plan in place and begin executing. But just know that you're not gonna reevaluate plans annually anymore. You're gonna reevaluate quarterly. I love the idea of sort of, it's called OKRs in the business world, or some people call them rocks, or just quarterly goals. But setting quarterly goals, striving hard after those goals, but knowing that every 3 months you're gonna sit down and look back and say what needs to change. And so I think about 2021 planning in quarters, not years, and just doing it with a pencil and knowing it's going to change. I also think a lot of nonprofits, they don't have sort of two plans. They have one plan, meaning this is what we're going to do. I think that's dangerous in turbulent times. I think it's important that you have a worst case crisis mode plan and a best case stretch goal plan, and you go like crazy after that stretch goal. But in the back of your mind, you know that you have a fallback to protect and sustain the organization. And so if you're not doing that today, I do think it's important to do that scenario planning, where you think, man, in a bad day, how would I cut budget? Where do I need to tighten the belt so that I don't impact my costs, right? And so I think both of those can be really important. And And again, not getting used to the idea of we're just, man, if we could just get this vaccine, we can go back to our galas. Like, don't think that way. Be innovative and look for new ways to go out and connect with donors that you haven't previously done.
Yeah, and it reminds me of this quote that you said to me a couple weeks ago, just don't let the crisis go wasted. Like, don't let the crisis go to waste. And it has been such an opportunity for innovation, and we have been pushed into innovation. It wasn't like a voluntary thing, but I'd love to hear from you what nonprofit leaders and fundraisers can be doing to make the most of this moment, especially this moment moving into 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I like this across all teams, but I think it's really effective in your communication fundraising team, which is work in 2-week sprints and be willing to test and fail fast. And so I think what that looks like on a lot of teams is sort of, we in the agile world is called sprint planning. And so you meet every 2 weeks, you say, here's what we're going to test and learn over the next 2 weeks. Here's what the deliverables are going to be, and here's what we're going to measure, and here's what we're going to learn. And then you try stuff like, hey, we've never done Facebook ads to drive giving before. Is a really good example. That shouldn't be a 6-month conversation. That should be can we spend $200 over the next 2 weeks to validate whether Facebook ads will work for us? And you get back in 2 weeks and you say, did that work or did that not work? And so those 2-week sprints or 2-week iterations of just fast testing and agility can be super, super powerful. What they allow you to do is, at a very low cost, they allow you to learn and fail fast at a very low risk. And so you can begin to identify the things that really work, where you really want to spend your energy. So I know a lot of nonprofits don't do that today, but the ones that do, they're able to move so much faster in times of crisis.
Oh, that's so good. That reminds me of a conversation that Noah and I've had about, where it's tempting to tinker to death, and it's harder to ship, but it's so important to ship because you can learn and try things and move more quickly and find the solution that will work.
Yeah. And to do that, by the way, you have to embrace a culture of it's okay to fail at your organization. So what's happened at so many nonprofits, this is what nonprofit where I worked, you're so afraid of the thing you're doing not working that you don't want to deliver the thing because your hand might get slapped. And
Right.
and so instead of doing that, foster culture, we're going to try a bunch of stuff, and if something fails miserably, we celebrate it, which sounds like a really weird thing to do, but you celebrate it because you learned something. It's like, oh, now we know our donors like this, they don't like that. That's really important. And so you have to embrace a culture where it's okay to fail and fail fast because you learn and get better.
Absolutely. Hey, one thing that I'd like to do
jump in
now.
here real quick, Hillary and Gabe, is that Gabe, you mentioned this 2-week sprint idea, and I think sometimes when we try to take a concept from like a for-profit or a technology or startup and translate that to like nonprofits, we get like it just gets a little sticky, and we almost get worried that it's not going to land. I am going to provide a resource in the chat pane from Sarah Olivieri. She was on the podcast months back, and she actually shares a nonprofit version of sprint planning that's brilliant. It's designed for nonprofits. She talks about it. So if you're curious about what Gabe just said, I'm going to drop this link. Spend 30 minutes listening to Sarah unpack this, because I think it's going to be essential for 2021.
That's great. Thanks, Noah.
Yeah, that's great. I would love, we've got just a couple of minutes left. If you have a question for Gabe, hop into the chat and share it. I'd love to open it up for a little bit of Q&A. I don't know if anyone's asked anything yet, Noah, that you'd want to jump in and share. But it's not often that you have access to a leader like Gabe. So if you have any questions, hop into the chat and ask. In the meantime,
yeah, there's nothing left. There's no other questions in the chat pane. I think this is something I know I've been thinking a lot about a leader. I know Gabe, we've been having conversations as a leader, is just the personal side. How do you keep teams healthy? How do you keep interpersonal connection? We've been talking about strategy, and that's kind of external, like how do we hit our goals? But how do we thrive as teams in 2021. And I think it's just an under socialized discussion. And I think we need to elevate a little bit more. So any thoughts around that, Gabe or Hillary? And I know it's kind of an ongoing question, but curious if you have any ending thoughts around that question.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is culture eats strategy for breakfast, which I think is even more true in nonprofit. It's so much burnout, so much turnover in nonprofit. It's hard to stay motivated. And so, especially in times like these, I think you have to be hyper focused on the culture of your organization, creating a healthy culture. And what that means is if you're a leader, probably spending more time than you have in the past, just doing one-on-ones with folks. I mean, maybe used to you do 2 one-on-ones a month. I think like personal health checks 2 times a week over Zoom is great. And don't lead in with, did you hit your KPI? Lead in with, how's your family doing? How you hanging in there? Those kind of questions. I think it's not, as driven leaders, it's not always the easiest thing to do, but I think it is so critical. And just knowing that sort of, that culture shift and more personal attention, it's not only good for us personally and good for our soul, but it's actually good for your organization. You're empowering your team to go out and fly and make big change, because if they're empowered culturally, that's going to be so much more important than did your strategy hit or not.
Absolutely. And I would say that's even more important right now when teams are distributed. It's so easy to just like hop on a Zoom call and just get to the point and like get it done and then separate again. So you have to strategically and thoughtfully, build those relationships and maintain those relationships.
That's great. Yeah, and I saw Ray made a good point here too about giving time off for COVID, for self-care. I think that's really important. It's hard when your program and fundraising team are slammed to be able to provide that bandwidth for your team to do self-care, but you will not regret it over the long run.
Absolutely. It's actually a good retention strategy because you don't want your people burning out, right? Before we go, I just want to make you aware of something that we have available. It's the responsive fundraising pack, and you can get it by emailing us at responsive@virtuous.org with the subject line TRW. That's the Responsive Weekly. That's what that stands for, in case you hadn't put those two together. But we'll send you a 30-minute video telling you about the why and how of responsive fundraising, 100-page responsive fundraising blueprint and playbook, and a self-paced responsive assessment to benchmark your nonprofit fundraising. So email responsive@virtuous.org with that subject line TRW, and we'll send that to you. It's a great resource as you're moving toward 2021, pivoting, writing that strategy, not in a pen, but in a pencil. I wish I had a pencil to show you, but I don't, because apparently I only use pens. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you again next week. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks, Noah.